Greetings, everyone. This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today's video is going to be concerning Mashi'ahh, Torah Kingship from the father to son, but not from mother to son. So, in order to introduce this particular topic, we have to identify how we determine what the facts are. And as I've mentioned in other videos, the way that we deal with facts in this area is to deal with something that's ancient, authentic, and authoritative. And that the Hebrew text of the Tanakh is what is the standard that we use. Specifically, the Torah is the foundation, and everything else goes upon that standard. Anything dealing with translation or issues of someone kind of inventing their own idea of how they think something works is not relevant to what we're talking about. The other issue is the standard also goes with the fact that when it comes to Torah Mashi'ahh communities, there's an agreement, whether it be amongst Indian, Sephardi, Habani, Mizrahi, Yemenite, Temani, or Orthodox Jews. There's an agreement on the national revelation at Mount Sinai, the written Torah, and the sources of oral Torah. So, starting on this topic, concerning the Torah itself, the Torah is the starting point, as I mentioned before, is the foundation. So, if we look in Devarim or Deuteronomy 17:14 through 15, and also 17, we see that the Torah explains fully when it deals with kingship and the rulership or the throne of a king over the entire nation of Israel, that, the Torah-based nation of Israel. The rulers of that Israeli nation are men only. And how do we derive that from from this particular text? It tells us in the part of the Torah, כי תבוא על הארץ אשר אדוני אלוהיך נותן לך, וירשתו, וישבתו בו, ואמרתו, עשימו עלי מלך. So starting off, what it mentions is that Moshe Rabbeinu is explaining to commanding to the generation that's about to go into the land of Israel, that whenever, when they, get into the land of Israel and when they, settle upon it, and that they, will say, like, give us, we will put upon ourselves a king, a melech. And it's important that this word is melech, because melech is, what do you call it, a noun that is masculine, meaning that it's not like anyone can be a melech, it only could be someone who's a man. Now, the word in Hebrew that could have been here, if someone, if the Torah was trying to say it could be a man or a woman, it would be malakah. But the fact that it's melech here is specific to the fact that it's talking about someone who's male. So then it continues and says, Kachol hajoyim, meaning like all the nations. So the people of Israel want a king. And this is specifically talking about the people of Israel wanting a king for the sake of doing a mitzvah, doing the will of Hashem. So Asher Sevivothoi. So, according to the nations that are around the people of Israel. And it says, Som tasim alecho melech. So, this is a command to put upon ourselves a king, a male king. Asher yivchar Adonai Elohecha bo. So it's someone that Hashem will choose, him. And again, the word bo means like in him, or with him. So this is something that also specifies that what we're talking about is someone who's a man. So it says, Migarev ahecho. So it's like from you, like amongst your brothers, your close relative brothers, and specifically talking about people who are, this is a man who's amongst the people of Israel, meaning that he comes from one of the 12 tribes. Because at this point, the tribe of, the tribe of Yehudah, and specifically of David, had not specifically been, called out as being, the path from which the kingship, that Hashem would choose would be through. But there are, hints in the Torah towards that, but it isn't specifically called out, specifically besides like one other mention that, could, be kind of cryptic depending on how you look at it. So it continues, it says, Tasim alecha melech. So again, I didn't highlight it here, but melech, again, masculine term, masculine noun. This is a male, particular person we're talking about. And then it continues to prove this point out and says, Lo tochal lethet alecho ish nochori. So it says specifically that, the Jewish people, the Israeli people, were not allowed to put upon ourselves a king who's someone who's not from the people of Israel, meaning he's not from one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And it specifically is here and says Ish, which is a man. So it specifically says, concerning we're not allowed to have a man, that's, outside of the people of Israel, outside of the Torah community, be someone who's, the leader or the king of the people of Israel, that we're not supposed to assign somebody of that. So let's say that someone converted to the Torah, that person could not be, king, and if, you go through generation after generation through the male line, that person can't be king through that male line. So it says, Asher lo ahichahu. So it's like it's not from amongst your brothers, meaning, the men of, the people of Israel that this person comes from. Then it continues, it says, Walo yarbe lo nashim. So this particular person who's supposed to be king, when they are appointed as king, and this is in verse 17, are not allowed to increase the amount of wives they have, which basically lets you know right there that we're only talking about a male here because it never comes back and says, okay, well, if it's a queen, she cannot have a bunch of husbands. Specifically, it's very specific to this issue. And then it continues, says, well, lo yasura lavovo, so he will not turn his heart, and that's one of the ideas that by having, too many wives, he could turn his heart. And it says, "Wachasef wazahov lo yarba lo meod." So he's not supposed to have a bunch of, like money, silver and gold. He's not supposed to increase those things, to, beyond a certain point. So we see from this part of the Torah that is very specific to the fact that a king, the rulership of the Jewish people, is specifically going to be someone through a male line, meaning that it's transferred from father to son specifically. So we'll continue and see exactly, what the Torah tells us about this issue of, whether or not this is true, what I'm saying, in terms of saying that it's specifically through the male line because of the fact that it's only mentioning a melech, a male king. So then if we go to Bemidbar, Numbers 1 and then verses 2 and 4, it deals with the concept of Torah government leadership and how that's also through the male lineage. So it says in verse chapter 1, verse 2, Sa'u at Rosh Kol Adath B'nai Yisrael. So it's like talking about like raising up the leadership, of the community of B'nai Yisrael, of the people of Israel. It says לממשפחותם, like according to like their families, לבית אבותם במספר השמות, כל הזכור לכל לג'ולבתם. So what this translates into is according to their families, according to the house of their fathers, according to their number, and then according to maleship, someone being male. Kol zachor is being all males. And this is the way that they're counted, for example, for leadership positions. And then it continues in verse 4 and says, Va'itachem yiyu, ish lamata, ish rosh lavet avoto hu. So again, it mentions this idea that this leadership amongst the tribes, for example, comes through a male, and it's someone who's like the head of their households. So we see here that this is specifically delineating that in the Torah-based system of society, being from the government system all the way down to the social system, that the leadership in the Torah-based community comes through the male line, for example. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that for example, that women had no place within the society to lead certain things. But when it came to the kingship, for example, and the tribal leadership, for example, which is a type of kingship, if you will, that all goes through the father's line and specifically from father to son. Meaning that it has to be through a male, transmission, for example. So someone can ask the question like, okay, hey, wait a minute. And I know, kind of expecting that somebody would ask this question. They could say, okay, wait, doesn't the Torah state in like Numbers 27, 8 through 11 that a woman can inherit from her father? And thus doesn't that allow for her to inherit the kingship or the throne from her father and then in turn transfer that to her son? And the answer to this is simply no. Because if you look at the text in the Hebrew, it makes it clear that the inheritance being talked about is what's called a nahalon, which is land-based family property and not a government position. It is also only in a situation where the man in question has no sons. It further requires judicial review and ruling as stated below. So this is something that comes out in that particular passage we're talking about. So if we read it in Hebrew, it says, "Wa'ela b'nei Yisrael tadaber lemor ish ki yomuth uven ein lo wa'avartem ala nacholotho levito." So what this specifically says is that if you have a man, so it says this is a command from Hashem, and this is after a situation where a group of women whose father had passed away were saying that he died with no sons, and essentially they were attesting the fact that his nahalo, his land rights, would have no heir to it. And that's when a ruling was made that in the circumstance where it says here, Ish ki yomuth, if there's a man who dies, uven ein lo, so he has no sons, wa'avartam ath nachalotho levito. So his like land right, will go to his daughter. But you'll notice, and I'll prove this in a second, it doesn't say anything about any kind of government position he has. That doesn't transfer to his daughter. And the reason for this is very simple. The fact that, the idea is that you don't want land to transfer, for example, from tribe to tribe. You don't want the tribe of Benjamin all of a sudden owning land in the tribe of Judah. And that's the basic idea here. So if the daughters, of a man who had no sons marry someone from a different tribe, then all of a sudden you could have a situation where, like, let's say their husbands or their sons, could say, okay, well, I will own a land in the place of Yehuda now, even though I'm from the tribe of Benjamin, so I can go over there and start taking control of the land. And that was the idea that this is actually talking about. So then, just to prove this point out, if we go to the encyclopedia, which is Encyclopedia Mikraith, it essentially explains the same idea, where it says נחלה. המושג נחלה מורו בעיקרו של אחוזת קרקע העוברת בירושה מדור לדור. So it's explaining that this is something that deals with land rights that transfer from generation to generation. And it continues to explain that this is something that, was transmitted, and explains that the sources in the Tanakh where it's mentioned, and also the conditions of the fact that this is something that's transferring, from father to son, for example, and is something that, in the circumstance we mentioned earlier, it can be transferred to a daughter, but only under the circumstance that there are no sons. So we have a clear definition here that this is not talking about kingship. And there's a specific reason why that's the case. And just simply put, and I'll get to this in a future slide. If you have a situation where you have someone, who, what the Torah specifically tells us that the king or the throne can only be held by someone who's a man. And if you have a situation where a woman cannot be, for example, the ruler, sitting on the throne, then she obviously can't transfer something that she herself can't take part in to her sons. Meaning that, like, let's say you have a situation where, okay, supposedly, like, let's say the king dies and you say he has no sons. Well, obviously, you can't transfer that to someone who doesn't have the ability to sit on the throne, and then that person can't transfer it to someone else, who's the descendant of theirs. That's one of the reasons that it can only go through specifically from, a father to a son, because the father has the right to be the king, and then therefore, at that circumstance, the son would have the right to be the king. It doesn't transfer through people who don't have the right to sit on the throne and be the king based on the Torah definition. So then we see that this is very simply, a matter of, okay, in one circumstance, you have a person who has sons, and then the Nachalah goes to his sons. Where in a situation where, he has no sons, then the Nachalah will go to his daughters, so that it stays within the family and doesn't transfer to other tribes. That was the whole point, of having this exception. And the thing that's important is an exception to the rule, meaning that, if the daughter dies, for example, what it basically does is it goes to other family members who exist if she herself didn't have any children. There's like a whole lengthy explanation of, exactly legally how that works. But the part that I didn't include here was that if you continue until I think it was like verse 11, it actually explains that all of this takes place within the judicial system, meaning that it isn't just like, okay, a man passes away, he only has daughters, he has no sons, and then he just simply hands over the keys to his daughters. It's a matter of that they have to go to court to be able to show, okay, he has no sons. We are, now the ones who are taking ownership of the land because he had no sons and it transfers to us. But it's specifically to the idea of a nachala. So then let's say, going back to this issue, because the reason that someone, this issue comes up about, transferring to daughters is that there are people who try to claim that, specifically, I guess, within the Christian realm, that they want to say that, the person that they believe to be Mashiach, had the right to have the kingship, or Mashiachness, if you will, pass through his mother, even though the text that they quote doesn't specifically say his mother was from the house of David. And it's one of those things. I'll probably do a different video to cover that. But consider the following. Even if someone wanted to try to claim that there's some way for a woman to pass on through to her sons the right to be Mashiach, if you will, or the kingship, it still goes against the reality of the following. If we look at the Tanakh, we see a situation you have David HaMelech, or King David, as you say in English. Well, he had a number of sons. So automatically we see that he didn't die without having any sons. First of all, his son Shlomo HaMelech, or King Solomon, became the king after him. But he also had a number of different sons: Amnon, Daniel, Avshalom, Adonio, Shaphatio, Yethiram, Shema, Shovev, Nathan, Yibhar, Elishama, Elishaphat. So he had a number of sons. So it wasn't like he died without sons. So that's not even applicable, even if it could be. So at the most, you could say, okay, well, again, even if you could apply it in that way, it isn't applicable because he has sons. But not only that, just recording, looking at his son, Shlomo HaMelech, for example, we know that, in the first temple period, he had sons, a number of them, but then we go further into the second temple period, and we know that his descendants still existed during the second temple period, or actually mentioned in the book of Ezra, for example. So we know that, all the sons he had still existed during that time, with the at least being seven, that we have recorded, knowing that there obviously would have been others, through other children of his, for example. And again, we only have certain records, in the Tanakh itself about certain things, but outside the Tanakh, there's always obviously records, for example. So then if we go a little bit further and say, okay, let's get past the second temple period. Is it possible that, for example, during the Second Temple period, all of the descendants of Shlomo Melech or Solomon were like, gone? Well, obviously not, because, we know that through Jewish history, there was a particular position that led the Jewish community after the destruction of the Second Temple called the Resh Guluthal. And the Resh Guluthal were descendants of King David through Solomon. And specifically, they lived, are mentioned in the Talmud and are, attested to by other Jewish sources, which is the way that you attest to someone's ancestry. It has to be through the Jewish community. Something outside of the Jewish community, like let's say someone writes a Greek text and says that this guy's ancestry was this and that, but it's in the hands of people who aren't Jewish, for example. That's not an attestation to their ancestry that's acceptable within the Jewish community. It has to be something that within the Jewish community you can back it up and verify it. So in this document you see here, which comes from the like 1100 CE, which is in the Cairo Geniza, it was like a storage center in Egypt for different documents. This one has an actual genealogy of some of the exilarchs, the leaders, which there were a number of them in Babylon, who were descendants of King David. It actually gives going from, the Adam Rishon to David all the way to like, one of the last leaders, which I'll show in just a second. And even if we're talking modernly, there are a number of modern Jewish families that have, claims to be descendants of King David through Solomon, such as some people from the Dayan family, the Shemach family out of Yemen, the Shalatiel family, Ibn Yahya family, the Ravanel family, and the Ben David family, including a lot of others. So if we look at this particular document, which is a genealogy of some of the exilarchs, what we can look at just quickly, just getting, into the bare facts of it. This particular section here is the section that actually mentions Shlomo ben David, this is a Yemei Mashiach, basically meaning that, this is noting that this is Solomon, son of David, who was known as the Mashiach of that time, which just basically meant he was anointed with oil. And he was, anointed in front of the public space as to be the leader of the Jewish people, David was. And once his son Shlomo, Solomon was born, there was no need for him to be anointed too, because he was, the descendant of who the king said should be the ruler. And then if we go further in this list going upwards, because the list starts here, reading from right to left, and goes downward, going back through history, meaning that this is the more recent history area part of it, and this is the part of King David, and this is going further down to Adam Rishon. We see here Adan bin Yosef ben Zakkai, and then going further and further through the list, which is basically the list shows this is Adan, son of Yosef, son of Zakkai, so on and so on and so on. And then it goes through and mentions the same thing I mentioned here until it gets to this point where it mentions Solomon. So we can see here that there's never been a situation where David didn't have a descendant somewhere, especially if you look at the number of children I just mentioned that he had, obviously, all of those guys weren't taken out in history, if you will. And this brings up the basic reality that there's no such thing as, for example, the kingship or the ability to, for the future Mashiach to come through a particular line. It doesn't happen through someone's mother. That's not, the mother doesn't have the right to be the king, and therefore she can't transmit the kingship to someone, to her descendants, for example. And it only is something that passes from father to son. And, of course, this claim being about, something that happened in the Second Temple period. Well, we obviously know in the Second Temple period, there were a number of Jews who descended from King David in the land of Israel and in Babylon and outside in different areas, such as North Africa, Arabia, and things like that. So there's no situation where someone can say, that there was a need, for, supposedly, if you will, this to be translated to, to a woman to use this idea of the Nachalah principle. And the Nachalah principle is only valid when there's no sons. And we know that there's never been a situation where David, had no descendants of his through a male line. So this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever. Thank you for listening. Take care and bye.